Parag Vav, Shvius Parag Vav, Mishnah Aleph. Shalosh Aratis LaShvius, there are three lands with respect to the Hilchis Shmita. The halachas of Shmita apply only to those parts of Eretz Yisrael that were sanctified by the Jewish people. There were two times they were Makadesh, the land, at two different periods in history. The first was performed by Yeshua, who led Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael following Yetzias Mitzrayim. This Kedusha came to an end some 800 years later, when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed and the people were exiled to Bavel. The land was sanctified again by Ezra, who led the people back from Bavel after 70 years of Golus. Ezra's Kedusha did not end with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, but is still in effect today. The Kedusha is still Kayam. However, not all parts of Eretz Yisrael that had been sanctified by Yeshua were re-niskadesh by Ezra. As a result, Hilchos Shmita in some parts of Eretz Yisrael are different than other parts. So Shalosh Aratzis LaShmita, there are three lands with regard to the Hilchos Shmita. Kol she'achziku olei Bavel me'Eretz Yisrael ad Kiziv loy nechal v'loy nevad. The first part, the first territory, is all the territory taken by those who came up from Bavel, which extends from southern Eretz Yisrael to Kiziv in the north, has full Kedusha Ha'aretz, loy nechal v'loy nevad. So Shemitah produce may not be eaten after the beer deadline has passed, unless the mitzvah of beer was performed, and the land may not be worked during Shemitah at all. Number 2, Kol she'achziku olei Mitzrayim Kiziv ad Anor v'ad Amona. All the territory taken by those who came up from Mitzrayim, but not by the olei Bavel, which includes the area extending from Kiziv to the river in the east. This is the northern stretch of the Euphrates, or the Farpar River near Damascus, which would be near Syria, and the area extending from Kiziv to Amona and to the west. Amona is Har HaHar, which is mentioned in Devarim. The northern border in the time of Yeshua extended from Amona in the west to the river in the east. Kiziv was on the northern border between those two landmarks. All the territory up to this border was niskadesh by Yeshua. However, together with the rest of Eretz Yisrael, it lost its kedusha when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. When Ezra led the Golus back to Bavel, they did not retake all the land that had been conquered previously. Thus, their territory reached no further north than Akko, except for a strip of land that ran from Akko to Kiziv. According to this explanation of the Mishnah, the towns of Akko and Kiziv mentioned here are not the same as the familiar Akko and Kiziv, which stand on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, marking the western border of Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah speaks only of the northern border. As far as the southern border is concerned, the returnees from Mitzrayim conquered the land all the way down to Nachal Mitzrayim, whereas the returnees from Bavel reached only as far as Ashkelon. So, Kol she'achziku olei Mitzrayim Kiziv ad Anor v'ad Amona is treated as Eretz Yisrael to some degree. Nechal avaloi neva. The Shemitah produce may be eaten without beer having been fulfilled, but the land may not be worked. Since the original Kedusha Sa'aretz by Yeshua was no longer in force, that which grows there during Shemitah may be eaten without beer. Nevertheless, the Rabbanon decreed that the land may not be worked during Shemitah. And number 3 is Min HaNahar u'me'amona v'lefnim nechal v'neva. The territory that extends farther to the north from the river and Amona is not part of Eretz Yisrael at all. And nechal v'nevad, its Shemitah produce may be eaten without beer, and the land may be worked. Mishnah Beis. Oisem betalish b'Suria, avaloi b'mechuber. So Syria is different Kedusha. The Mishnah deals with the land of Syria, which was conquered by David HaMelech. However, because he took Syria on his own initiative before all of Eretz Yisrael was conquered, his action is described as kibbutz yochid, a conquest of an individual which does not suffice to make the land part of Eretz Yisrael. The Chachamim, though, treated Syria like Eretz Yisrael in some areas of halacha. In Eretz Yisrael proper, the Torah Asher is working with attached produce, which is produce that has not been detached from its natural place of growth, unless one does so in an unusual manner. Furthermore, midrabanon, even work done with detached produce must be done in an unusual manner. The various isurim against working in the usual manner apply only to Shemitah produce that the owner illegally prevented the public from taking. However, produce that was declared ownerless, was made hefker, and made available to the public as required by halacha, may be processed in the usual way, even in Eretz Yisrael proper, even when it is still attached to the ground. The Mishnah teaches how these rules apply in Syria. So, Oisem betalish b'Suria, we may process detached Shemitah produce in Syria in the usual manner, even though with Rabbanon it's aser in Eretz Yisrael. In this respect, the Chachamim treated Syria more leniently than in Eretz Yisrael. Although the Rabbanon prohibited working in the usual manner which detached Shemitah produce, which grew in a field that was guarded shaloi kedin, they did not extend this prohibition to produce of Syria. Thus, Produce from Surya may be processed in the usual manner once it has been detached, even if it came from a guarded field. The Rabbanan were makel in this respect regarding Surya, so that the poor could find work close to Eretz Yisrael and need not travel further away to earn their livelihood. But we may not process attached produce of Surya in the usual manner, because regarding this halacha, the Chachamim did treat Surya like Eretz Yisrael. Minat Torah, one is also to process Shemitah produce that's still attached to its source, and it grew in a guarded field, unless he does it in an unusual manner. Midrabanan, this restriction applies in Surya as well. The Rabbanan treated Surya stringently regarding this law, so that Jews do not move out of Eretz Yisrael proper and settle in Surya to escape the restrictions of Shemitah and probably other mitzvahs at Tliyas Ba'aretz as well. Surya is not counted as a fourth land in addition to the three listed in the previous Mishnah, because the halacha in Surya is the same as the halacha in the areas of Eretz Yisrael conquered only by Yeshua. Just as work with detached produce is permitted in Surya, so is it permitted in these parts of Eretz Yisrael. When the previous Mishnah stated that working is forbidden in the lands conquered by Yeshua, it was referring only to work done with attached produce, and certainly the land itself, but not to work done with detached produce. Dashin, v'zayrin, v'darchin, v'ma'amrin, avaloi kaitrin, v'loi baitrin, v'loi maiskin. We may thresh, winnow, grain, crush grapes, and gather produce in the usual manner in Surya, since these activities are done with the produce that has been detached from its source. But we may not harvest grain, grapes, or olives in the usual manner in Surya, because this work is done with attached produce. In Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh that is, there's a separate term for harvesting each of the major types of crops grown in Eretz Yisrael. Ktsira refers to harvesting of grain. Bitsira refers to harvesting of grapes, and Mesika to harvesting olives. Each one is miyuchat. Klal Amar Rabbi Kiva stated a rule: Kol shekayetze by mutar be'eretz Yisrael, oised b'Surya. Any work that the likes of which is permitted in the land of Eretz Yisrael in the usual manner according to the Torah, meaning minat Torah midaraisa, work done with detached produce may be performed in the usual manner in Surya, even midrabanan. Work that minat Torah is mutar in Eretz Yisrael, despite being asur midrabanan, is completely permitted in Surya. However, that which is asur minat Torah in Eretz Yisrael is going to be asur midrabanan in Surya. Mishnah Gimel. If onions were picked in the 6th year, they were replanted during Shemitah against the halacha, then rain fell on them and they grew more during Shemitah. The halacha is that if their leaves became dark green, which shows that they drew nutrients from the ground during Shemitah, they are forbidden. The leaves and the onions are going to be subject to the restrictions of the Shemitah produce. The status of vegetables with regard to Shemitah is determined by the year in which they are picked. Therefore, these onions which were picked in the 6th year should be mutter. Nevertheless, because they were replanted and picked again during Shemitah, they changed from pears from Yerakas that are mutter in the 6th year to pears from the 7th year, which are asur. The additional Shemitah growth, though smaller than the growth of the 6th year, transforms the entire plant, converting it into a Shemitah produce. Hayriku hare elu mutar. However, if the leaves became pale, which shows that they did not grow from the ground, but from the onions themselves, they are permitted and they are not Shemitah produce. The pale yellowish color of the leaves indicates that they are soon to wilt, which shows that they did not draw nourishment from the ground, but from the onion itself. The onions are therefore permitted as growths of the 6th year only. If the onions can be plucked from the ground by the leaves, which is a sign that the leaves are strong, they are forbidden as Shemitah produce even if the leaves remain pale and do not darken. When the onions have finished growing, they protrude a little from the ground. They can be pulled out completely by the leaves. Chanina holds that if the leaves are strong enough for this, they must have drawn nourishment from the ground, even if they turn pale, because otherwise they would break when pulled. In the previous case, the onions were picked from the 6th year, then replanted and picked during Shemitah, thus going from the category of Peres Hamutar Bashishis to the category of Kedusha Shvius, which is also provided that they grew from the ground during Shemitah. The Mishnah now is going to teach a halacha that applies when these very onions that were picked during Shemitah were then replanted and picked in the 8th year. The opposite case, where the onions grew during Shemitah, then grew again after Shemitah, they are mutter. They're not subject to Kedusha Shvius. That is, if these onions are replanted and picked in the 8th year, they become the ordinary 8th year produce. Just as the Shemitah growth made the onions forbidden, as the Mishnah taught above, the 8th year growth makes them permitted again. The Mishnah refers to onions that grew and were picked in the 6th year, at which point they were classified as ordinary 6th year onions. They were then replanted against Salacha, Shalaikidin, during Shemitah, and started to grow again from the ground, as indicated by one of the signs mentioned earlier. And then, because they were uprooted during Shemitah, because of their Shemitah growth, even if it's small, they became reclassified as Shemitah onions, as the Mishnah mentioned above. They were then planted a 3rd time during the 8th year. The Mishnah teaches that if they grow a little more during the 8th year, they change their status again, this time from being classified as sacred Shemitah onions to being classified as ordinary 8th year onions. In general, a small amount of 8th year growth cannot make Shemitah produce permissible. In this case, however, the additional growth does permit the onions because they grew mostly in the 6th year. Thus, even after a small amount of Shemitah growth made them forbidden, the small amount of 8th year growth combined with the main growth of the 6th year renders them permitted again. Mishnah Daled. The Mishnah defines when in the 8th year it may be assumed that the vegetables being sold in the market are not Shemitah produce. For when after Shemitah is a person allowed to buy vegetables in the market and treat them as non-Shemitah produce. From when the 8th year crop of that species has reached the same level of ripeness as the produce that's being sold in the market. When the vegetables of the crop planted in the 8th year have become as ripe as those being sold, the buyer may assume that the vegetables on sale grew and were picked in the 8th year and are not subject to Shemitah restrictions. Also, habakir hutar ha'ofel. Furthermore, when the early ones become ripe, they permit the late ones. That is to say, if a species ripens early in one place, one is permitted to buy the same type of produce even in a place where it ripens later, because one may assume that it came from the place where it ripens early. Sometimes a species of vegetables ripens faster in one place than in another. The Mishnah teaches that as soon as the vegetables in one place have grown as ripe as those being sold, the buyer is allowed to buy these species anywhere, even in a place where it has not yet grown so ripe. It can be assumed that those being sold come from the place where they ripen faster and are not Shemitah produce. Rebbe allowed someone to buy vegetables immediately after Shemitah and treat them as non-Shemitah produce because most of the vegetables sold in Eretz Yisrael were imported from outside the country, so a buyer could assume that he was buying produce that did not grow in Eretz Yisrael. Nevertheless, Rebbe permitted this only after Shemitah, not during Shemitah itself. Mishnah Hey. We may not export oil of truma that must be burnt because it became tamei, or Shemitah produce from Eretz Yisrael to outside Eretz Yisrael, because the procedures that require the burning of the truma oil must be done in Eretz Yisrael. Truma that is tamei may not be eaten even by kohanim; rather it has to be burnt. Such oil is therefore called shemen sreifa, oil that must be burnt. The Mishnah mentions oil only as an example. The same halacha would apply to truma of any produce that is tamei. The Rabbanon, there's a level of kedusha similar to kachim by truma. To this end, they decree that just as offerings, just as karbanos that became disqualified must be burnt in the place where they have been eaten, had they remained qualified, that is, either in the Beis HaMikdash or in Yerushalayim, so too truma that's tamei must be destroyed in Eretz Yisrael, since that's the proper place for eating truma. It's learned from a pasuk in the Torah that the biur of Shemitah produce must be performed in Eretz Yisrael specifically. To prevent biur from being done outside the country, the Rabbanon decreed that Shemitah produce may not be taken out of Eretz Yisrael even before it becomes subject to biur. Truma that's tar certainly may not be taken out of Eretz Yisrael, because the Rabbanon decreed that foreign lands are tamei, and it's forbidden to cause truma to become tamei. The Mishnah teaches that even truma that's already tamei may not be taken outside of Eretz Yisrael. Right? Maybe it's a problem because you're meisif tumal tumasai, but be'ikar that's the halacha that you can't take truma outside of Eretz Yisrael. Reb Shimon says, "Shemati b'feirush hamitzin l'Surya." I heard explicitly that we may export these items from the land of Eretz Yisrael to Syria, but we may not export them to other places outside of Eretz Yisrael. Reb Shimon agrees that these procedures must be performed in Eretz Yisrael. However, he holds that Syria is considered part of Eretz Yisrael, even according to the biblical law in Torah. He disagrees with the Tana and Mishnah Beis. Accordingly, whatever must be done in Eretz Yisrael may be done in Syria as well. There's no reason then to prohibit taking these items to Syria. Okay, Mishnah Vav. Ein mevi'in truma mechutz la'aretz la'aretz. According to Minat Torah, the chiyuv to separate trumas and ma'aser applies only to produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael. The Chacham, however, extended the chiyuv to include the produce of certain countries that are near Eretz Yisrael, Bavel, Mitzrayim, Ammon, Moav, and Syria, as the Mishnah speaks in Yadayim. Ein mevi'in truma mechutz la'aretz la'aretz. One may not import truma from outside the land of Eretz Yisrael into the land of Eretz Yisrael, because if this were allowed, Kohanim might leave Eretz Yisrael to obtain truma. If one were allowed to bring truma into Eretz Yisrael from other countries, Kohanim might leave Eretz Yisrael to get truma and bring it back with them. This would thus violate the general isser against any Jew, whether a Kohen or not, leaving Eretz Yisrael. The Rabbanon therefore were geyser that truma may not be imported into Eretz Yisrael. This would discourage Kohanim from leaving Eretz Yisrael to obtain truma, for if they cannot bring it back with them, they will not get it from there in the first place. Reb Shimon says, "Shamati b'feirush hamivi'in l'Surya." I heard explicitly that we may import truma into the land of Eretz Yisrael from Syria. Ve'ein mevi'in mechutz la'aretz, but we may not import truma into the land of Eretz Yisrael from other places outside the land. Reb Shimon holds that Syria is part of Eretz Yisrael.